Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. How would you answer if someone asked you what the biggest thing standing between you and the person you're capable of becoming or of achieving your dreams? I bet many of us would say it's our circumstances, but what if it's not? What if it's really a quiet belief that we've already learned enough? Because the moment we stop being teachable, we don't just stop learning, we actually stop growing. And when we stop growing, we stop moving into that next version of ourselves that's going to accomplish all those great things. Welcome back to the Lead Well, Live Whole podcast. I'm Michael Sirmon, and every week we slow down long enough to think a little deeper about what it means to lead with clarity, live with purpose, and become the person God created us to be. You know, we've had the grandkids with us for a few weeks now, and interacting with them has got me to thinking about how differently children approach the world than we adults do. I mean, spend a few moments with a child, and you'll probably hear more questions than statements. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly? Why is the grass green? Why can't I touch that? Why do I have to go to sleep now? I mean, their curiosity is endless because they're not trying to prove anything, right? They're not trying to prove how smart they are, and they don't feel embarrassed by what they don't know. In fact, not knowing is what makes the world so exciting to them. Every answer opens the door to another question, and every question becomes an opportunity to grow. I remember my mother talking about when I was a child that I asked questions about everything. I wanted to know how everything worked, what everything come from, and why people did what they did and things did what they did, to the point that, she would give like a quarter to encourage my brothers and sisters to talk and to share something, but she'd actually give me a quarter to shut up. And it's funny, but it's true. I was incredibly curious. But as I'm watching these grandkids and I'm thinking, these cats are different, right? Not because they're weird kids, just because they're kids. And kids look at life differently than we do. I remember when we were in Texas, and one of our grandsons, we were talking, and I said, if you could be anything in the world, what would it be? One of my favorite questions. And he said, I would be a duck. And I'm like, what do you mean you would be a duck? He said, I would be a duck. I mean, there was no hesitation in his answer. And I said, okay, why would you be a duck? He said, well, because then I could go outside and play whenever I wanted. In my mind, it made no sense. But in his mind, he knew exactly why he was doing it, because he looked at it from his perspective. And all of us as kids, we had that something, that imagination, that drive, that desire to learn and the desire to know, right? We were going to grow up to be astronauts or the president or a spy or whatever it may be. But then somewhere along the way, something changes. And we don't just wake up one morning and decide that we've had enough learning. But life really has a subtle way of shifting our perspectives. As we grow, we begin to gain experience. We begin to build careers. We begin to raise families and become more confident in our abilities. But we also become more invested in who we are, in who people see us as, in people seeing us as being capable. So without ever saying it aloud, many of us began believing that mature people should have all the answers instead of asking questions. We start protecting what we know and protecting ourselves and our ego and our image instead of remaining curious about what we don't know. And it's a very subtle and quiet and insidious shift. In fact, I think it's one of the most dangerous shifts we can make, because the moment we become more committed to appearing right than becoming better, our growth begins to slow. And eventually it slows to the point that it stops entirely. I've caught myself doing this more than once. Someone offers feedback, and before they're even finished speaking, I'm already preparing my response. Have you ever noticed yourself doing that? You're still looking at them. You might even be nodding your head. I call that the bobblehead syndrome. But inside, you stopped listening because you're busy defending yourself already. You're already building your explanation of why they misunderstood, why your situation is different, or why they don't have the whole story. And maybe they don't, but maybe they do. The problem is that if I've already decided they can't teach me anything, I'll never discover whether they had something I needed to hear. That realization has humbled me more than once. And I've learned that being experienced and being teachable are not really the same thing. In fact, experience can sometimes become the greatest obstacle to growth, right? Too much success early on stops us from seeking that next opportunity, that next challenge, that next risky venture, right? So then the longer we do it, and the easier then it is to assume we've already seen everything there is to see. I mean, success can quietly whisper, you've got this figured out. And if we're not careful, we start to believe it. Yet the people that I've admired most in my life, right, they've all had something in common. The more they accomplished, the more curious they seemed. They asked thoughtful questions, and then they listened. They listened carefully. They listened intently, right? They welcomed ideas that challenged their own thinking. They never acted like they had arrived. One of my favorite things to do when I'm leading a team, when we're working on a plan, is I began looking for disaffirming information, because we all want to hear those things that confirm or affirm why we're right or why this is the right plan. But the last thing I will always ask my team is, where will this fail? Why will this fail? And if you've created an environment of trust, then your team will begin to evaluate it from a perspective that you don't have, and they'll begin to show you the failure points. And when you see the failure points, then you can develop the plan to mitigate them. So in life, I think that there's a lot of times that we should step back, especially the more confident we feel about something. Step back and ask ourselves, what do I not know? What do I not know that I should know? In fact, in coaching, it's kind of interesting. The instructor that I was under in this certification program I just finished, I was listening to one of his sample sessions, and he's talking to this lady. She's a very accomplished lady that leads a huge international nonprofit, and she's talking about their goals and their strategies for the next year. And he stopped and he said, "What questions should I be asking you?" Right? And at first I thought, well, that's a weird question. But the truth is, there's a lot about where she was at that he didn't know. And then if he just got quiet and let her think it through, she began to ask the questions from the areas that she was nervous about, or the areas that she was blank in. And that then revealed what she wasn't able to articulate in the beginning. And then they dove into that, and they came up with a plan for it. And I think there's value in doing that in our life sometimes, stopping and asking ourselves, what do I not know that I need to know? But back to these people that I've always admired, right? I don't think it's coincidence that all the ones I really admire ask really good questions, because I think humility and teachability have always walked hand in hand. Humility isn't pretending you know less than you do. It's simply recognizing that no matter how much you've learned, there's still more to discover. And it's being confident enough to say, I hadn't thought about it that way, right? I haven't thought about it that way, without feeling like your identity is somehow threatened. That's a rare quality today, because our culture often celebrates certainty more than curiosity. We reward quick questions, strong convictions, and immediate answers. But wisdom has never been measured by how quickly someone speaks. More often than not, wisdom is revealed by how well someone listens. One of the questions I've started asking myself from time to time is this: when was the last time someone genuinely changed my mind? Not because they argued louder or embarrassed me into agreeing with them, but because they helped me see something I hadn't seen before. And if I struggle to answer that question, maybe it's not because no one's had anything valuable to say, but maybe it's because I became harder to teach than I realized. And I didn't know until I got into my first work with my first coach that I really was. not coachable. I always thought I was, right? I've always been open. I'm open-minded. I will listen to you. I will hear. I'll adjust as I need to adjust. But as I'm working with him and working with the next couple coaches, I realized I was very difficult to coach. And once I realized that, though, and started making a conscious effort to learn from the coaching and not go into it as though I knew more than what the coach did, then I began to get something out of the coaching experience. But, there's another question, though, that we need to ask that's just as challenging. Who in my life has permission to tell me the truth, right? We all like encouragement. We like affirming information or affirming feedback. We all enjoying that we're doing well. But do we have someone or someones who can lovingly point out a blind spot without us immediately becoming defensive? Someone who can tell us that we've missed the mark or made a poor decision, or maybe even allowed pride to creep into our thinking. These people, they're not a nuisance. These people are gifts from God, even if they don't feel like it at the moment, right? And the older I get, the more convinced I become that one honest conversation can change the direction of a life if we're willing to receive it. And I think that's one of the reasons Scripture speaks so often about wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 9:9 says, "Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be yet wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning." And I've always loved that verse because it completely turns our assumptions upside down, right? We tend to think that wise people no longer need instruction, but Solomon says exactly the opposite. The truly wise are the ones who continue receiving it. And wisdom isn't the absence of correction, it's the willingness to embrace correction. And when you look throughout the Bible, that's exactly what you see. David wasn't a man after God's own heart because he never failed. He was a man after God's heart because when God confronted him, David repented instead of pretending, right? Go back to the garden. Adam, when he was confronted by God, "Oh, this woman you gave me," the exact opposite. They started looking for excuses, passing the blame, right? Peter made mistakes, and those mistakes would have disqualified many people in our eyes, but Jesus didn't discard him. He restored him because Peter remained teachable. And even the Apostle Paul, after all he'd accomplished, right, he continued describing his life as though he were pressing forward. He was reaching, he was growing, he was becoming. None of those men had arrived. They understood that following God meant allowing him to keep shaping them for the rest of their lives. And maybe that's where this becomes personal for all of us. We often pray for God to change our circumstances, but what if he's more interested in changing us? What if the difficult coworker isn't only testing our patience, but teaching it? What if the disappointment we're trying so desperately to escape is also revealing something about our hearts? What if the criticism we dismissed too quickly contained a seed of truth that could have made us better? And those aren't easy questions because they require us to admit we might not already know everything we need to know. And I don't believe becoming teachable means believing everyone else is right. It doesn't. It doesn't mean abandoning discernment or accepting every opinion that comes our way. It simply means approaching life with open hands instead of closed fists. It means asking, "Lord, is there something you want me to learn here?" before deciding we've already figured it out. And that posture will change everything because God has an incredible way of teaching us through unexpected people, unexpected circumstances, and unexpected moments, but only if we're willing to pay attention. So as I reflect on my own life, I realize the seasons that shaped me most weren't the seasons when everything went well, but they were the seasons that forced me to confront assumptions, where I had to admit my weaknesses and sometimes let go of the illusions that I had let control me, or the illusion that I had life under control, right? I wouldn't volunteer to relive many of those moments, but I also wouldn't trade what they produced. Looking back, I can see that God wasn't simply solving problems, he was forming my character. He wasn't just answering prayers, he was answering a much deeper prayer, often the one that I didn't even know I was praying, that prayer to become more like Christ. So maybe the question for today isn't whether you're intelligent enough, experienced enough, or successful enough. Maybe the question is much simpler than that. Are you still teachable? When someone offers correction, do you listen? When Scripture challenges an area of your life, do you surrender? When God nudges your heart in a direction that you didn't expect, are you willing to follow? Those moments, they rarely make the headlines, but they quietly determine who you're becoming. So as we close, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. The person that you will be 5 years from now won't simply be the result of the opportunities you receive or the obstacles you overcome. They will also be shaped by your willingness to remain teachable along the way. Every conversation, every setback, every success, every relationship, and every page of scripture carries the possibility of changing us if we'll approach it with a humble heart. My hope is that no matter how much experience we gain or how many accomplishments we collect, we'll never lose the curiosity of a child or the humility of a disciple, that we will never lose that desire to be a duck. So thank you for spending these few moments with me today. And if this conversation encouraged you, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with someone who might need it. You can also find more articles, leadership resources, and coaching information at michaelsirmon.com. So until next time, keep leading well, living whole, and never lose the courage to remain teachable. If today's conversation raised a question you've been wrestling with, I'd love to help. I offer one-on-one coaching for individuals navigating pressure, transition, and important decisions. You can learn more at michaelsirmon.com.